In the dense cloud forests of Panama, where ancient paths wind through impenetrable jungle, two young women vanished without explanation. What searchers discovered weeks later would challenge every assumption about their fate. The evidence told a story so contradictory and disturbing that investigators abandoned conventional explanation. This is the case that transforms a simple hiking accident into something far more sinister. But before we start, subscribe to never miss another disturbing revelation. It was April 1st, 2014, just after 11 in the morning, in the mountain town of Boquete, Panama. The air hung thick with moisture as Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, two Dutch women in their early 20s, prepared for what should have been a routine day hike. Kris, tall and blonde with an adventurous spirit, had convinced her friend Lisanne, a quieter brunette with careful planning habits, to explore the famous Pianista Trail. The trail begins innocuously enough, winding through coffee plantations and offering spectacular views of the Baru volcano. Local guides typically accompany tourists, but the women chose to venture alone. They carried a single backpack containing water, snacks, and 2 cameras. Lisanne brought her Samsung Galaxy phone, while Kris carried an iPhone. According to official reports, the women set out from the trailhead around 11 that morning. The Pianista Trail stretches approximately 5 miles through increasingly dense cloud forest before reaching the Continental Divide. Beyond that point, the path becomes treacherous, descending into unmarked jungle terrain where even experienced guides exercise extreme caution. The last confirmed sighting placed both women at a local restaurant earlier that morning, where they appeared relaxed and excited about their planned adventure. The restaurant owner, a middle-aged woman named Carmen, later told investigators something peculiar. She claimed an elderly indigenous woman had approached the Dutch tourists outside the restaurant, speaking urgently in broken Spanish about staying on the marked path. Carmen dismissed this as local superstition, but the interaction troubled her enough that she remembered it clearly weeks later. When the women failed to return by evening, their host family contacted local authorities. Search teams began combing the trail the following day, but the dense canopy and frequent afternoon rains complicated their efforts. The Pianista Trail winds through some of Panama's most challenging terrain, where visibility drops to mere feet and sounds become distorted by the thick vegetation. Days passed without any trace of the missing women. Search dogs lost their scent at various points along the trail, behaving erratically and refusing to continue in certain directions. Local volunteers reported finding unusual markings carved into trees near the trail's midpoint, symbols that didn't match any known indigenous writing systems. Park rangers dismissed these findings as unrelated vandalism, but photographs taken by search teams show deliberate geometric patterns that appear freshly carved. 10 days after the disappearance, something extraordinary occurred. Lisanne's phone began registering on cell towers sporadically, sending brief digital handshakes to the network before disappearing again. These signals originated from deep within the jungle, far beyond where the trail officially ended. Technical analysis revealed the phone was being powered on and off repeatedly, as if someone was desperately trying to establish contact with the outside world. The breakthrough came 73 days later, when a local woman discovered the women's backpack along the banks of the Culebra River, miles from the original trail. The bag's contents were meticulously preserved, despite months of exposure to tropical conditions. Inside, investigators found both phones, Lisanne's camera, personal items, and $90 Panamanian in cash. The backpack showed no signs of animal interference or significant weathering, despite the harsh jungle environment. The camera contained over 100 photographs documenting the women's final hours. The images begin normally, showing typical tourist shots of the trail, scenic overlooks, and the women posing together. These photos establish a timeline, placing them at the trail's summit around 1 in the afternoon. However, the final daytime photograph shows something deeply unsettling. In the background, barely visible through the trees, a human figure appears to be watching the women from a considerable distance. The figure's posture and positioning suggest deliberate observation rather than coincidental presence. After this final daylight image, the camera remained unused for several hours. Then, beginning at 1 in the morning on April 8th, over 90 flash photographs were taken in rapid succession during the dark hours. These nighttime images reveal fragments of the jungle floor, rock formations, and what appears to be a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and leaves. Several photographs show a plastic bag tied to a branch with what looks like candy wrappers inside, suggesting the women were rationing their limited food supplies. The most disturbing nighttime photograph shows Kris's hair, blonde and disheveled, against a dark background. Her face remains out of frame, but the positioning suggests she was lying down or incapacitated. This image was taken 6 days after their disappearance, indicating at least one woman survived far longer than initially believed. The camera's timestamp function confirms these photographs were taken over multiple nights, with the final image captured on April 8th. Phone records revealed equally puzzling information. Both devices showed numerous attempts to call emergency services, but the calls failed to connect due to poor signal strength. The women's phones were powered on and off systematically, suggesting they were conserving battery life while repeatedly attempting to establish communication. The final successful power on occurred 11 days after their disappearance, long after rescue teams had concentrated their search efforts elsewhere. 2 months later, local indigenous people discovered human remains scattered along the same river where the backpack was found. The bones were identified as belonging to both women through dental records and DNA analysis. However, the condition and distribution of the remains raised immediate questions among forensic investigators. Some bones showed signs of bleaching that typically requires extended exposure to harsh chemicals or extreme environmental conditions not present in the jungle. Most disturbing was the condition of Kris's pelvic bone, which exhibited unusual fracture patterns inconsistent with a fall or animal attack. The bone appeared to have been broken by blunt force trauma, then somehow reassembled with precision that defied natural explanation. Lisanne's foot was discovered still inside her boot, but the surrounding bones showed no signs of decomposition that would normally accompany such preservation. The forensic analysis revealed additional anomalies. Several bone fragments contained traces of phosphorus compounds not naturally occurring in the jungle environment. These chemicals are typically associated with industrial processes or specialized preservation techniques. When questioned about these findings, the lead forensic investigator abruptly terminated the examination and classified the remaining evidence as inconclusive. Local residents began sharing stories that had been suppressed during the initial investigation. Multiple witnesses reported seeing lights moving through the jungle canopy on several nights following the women's disappearance. These weren't the random patterns of flashlights or torches, but coordinated movements suggesting organized activity in areas supposedly inaccessible to humans. A coffee plantation worker claimed he heard voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize coming from the direction where the remains were eventually discovered. The indigenous community revealed they had warned authorities about unusual activity in that section of jungle for several months prior to the women's disappearance. Hunting parties reported finding cleared areas where the vegetation had been cut in perfect geometric patterns, similar to the tree carvings discovered during the initial search. These clearings appeared overnight and showed no signs of machinery or traditional cutting tools. Perhaps most significantly, the elderly woman who had warned the Dutch tourists outside the restaurant came forward with additional information. She claimed her grandmother had told stories about specific areas of the jungle where people vanished, always during certain lunar phases. April 1st, 2014 coincided precisely with a new moon when the jungle canopy becomes completely impenetrable to natural light. The official investigation concluded that Kris and Lisanne became lost after straying from the marked trail, then succumbed to exposure and dehydration. Their remains were scattered by natural river flow and animal activity over the course of several months. However, this explanation fails to account for the systematic phone usage, the pristine condition of their backpack, the unusual preservation of evidence, or the forensic anomalies discovered during examination. The case file was sealed by Panamanian authorities 6 months after the women's remains were identified. Dutch investigators who had traveled to Panama to assist with the case reported significant obstacles in accessing evidence and witness testimony. Several key pieces of forensic evidence, including the most disturbing nighttime photographs and detailed bone analysis reports, were classified as sensitive material and removed from public documentation. What do you think really happened to Kris and Lisanne during those 11 days in the Panamanian jungle? Subscribe to explore more cases where the official explanation raises more questions than it answers.